We bought a house together as best friends. 2 years later, one of us showed up with a lawyer and a different definition of equal. Background. I've been sitting on this story for about 6 months now, waiting until everything was fully resolved before posting. Some of you might recognize pieces of this situation. Maybe you've lived something like it yourself, or maybe you've watched a friendship dissolve in slow motion and wondered if there was anything you could have done differently. I'm writing this partly to process it, and partly because I genuinely think there are lessons here that could save someone else from the same mistake. My name doesn't matter. You can call me Marcus. I'm 38, a contractor by trade. Specifically, I do residential renovation and project management. I've been doing it for 16 years. I know how to swing a hammer, read a blueprint, manage a subcontractor, and spot a deal on a distressed property from 50 yards away. What I apparently didn't know, going into this, was how to protect myself legally when doing business with someone I trusted completely. That someone was Derek. Derek is 41, a financial analyst who's been in the investment world since his mid-20s. We met in our early 30s through a mutual friend's backyard barbecue, the kind of lazy summer afternoon where you end up talking for 4 hours and realize you found someone on the same wavelength. Over the next several years, Derek and I became genuinely close. Weekend hikes. Fantasy football leagues. The kind of friend you call when something good happens because you want to tell him before anyone else. So when the opportunity came up, it felt natural. More than natural, it felt like the universe had arranged it specifically for us. The setup. It was late 2021 when I spotted the property. A 3-bedroom craftsman bungalow in a neighborhood that I'd been watching quietly for about 2 years. The area was on the edge of gentrification. You could see it coming like a slow tide. New coffee shop on the corner. Young professionals moving in 2 blocks over. A park renovation approved by the city council. I knew the neighborhood. I knew what was coming. The house itself was a disaster. The previous owner had been an elderly man whose kids had let the property sit for 3 years after he went into a memory care facility. Roof was shot. Kitchen hadn't been updated since the early 90s. The electrical panel was a fire hazard. The hardwood floors were buried under 3 layers of carpet and linoleum. But the bones were extraordinary. Original craftsman details, wide lot, south-facing backyard, solid foundation. It was exactly the kind of property I'd been trained my entire career to recognize. The asking price was $310,000. I called Derek the same afternoon I walked through it. I laid out everything, the condition, the location, the trajectory of the neighborhood, my professional assessment of what it would take to renovate. My estimate was $90,000 in materials and subcontracted work, plus roughly 800 to 1,000 hours of my own labor over 6 to 8 months. If we executed well, I believed we'd have a property worth $550,000 to $600,000 within 18 months of purchase. Derek listened carefully, asked smart questions. He always asked smart questions, and called me back 2 days later. "I'm in," he said. "But I can't do the work. You know that. I can do the money." This is where I should have paused. This is where, if I could go back, I would sit down with an attorney before saying another word. Instead, I said what felt obvious and true in that moment. "That's fine. You front the capital, I put in the labor. We split the profit 50-50 when we sell." We shook on it. Digitally, over a video call, but we shook on it. Derek wired the down payment. We took out a joint mortgage for the remainder, with Derek covering the monthly payments since I would be working the property rather than drawing income from it during the renovation period. We did eventually sign a basic partnership agreement, 2 pages, drafted by neither of our attorneys because we didn't want to make it weird. It said we were equal partners in the property. It said proceeds would be split evenly upon sale. It said nothing, absolutely nothing, about how labor contribution would be valued, how disputes would be resolved, or what would happen if one party wanted to sell and the other didn't. 2 pages. For a decision that would ultimately involve nearly $1 million. I started work in January 2022. The work. I want to be specific here, because this matters later. Over the next 8 months, I worked that house the way you work something you love and believe in. I gutted the kitchen and rebuilt it from scratch. I replaced the roof. I rewired the electrical panel and brought the entire house up to code, pulling permits, passing inspections, doing everything correctly and documentably. I refinished those hardwood floors. I renovated both bathrooms. I rebuilt the back deck. I repainted the entire exterior. I landscaped the yard. I kept a detailed log of every hour I worked. Not because I expected to need it, but because that's how I operate professionally. Timesheets are habit. By the time I wrapped up the major work in August 2022, my log showed 1,147 hours of personal labor. At my standard billing rate of $85 per hour, which is actually below market for a contractor with my credentials in our city, that represented $97,495 in labor value. The house had also come in over budget on materials. Not by a lot, but by enough, $112,000 total instead of $90,000. Derek covered it without complaint. His total cash outlay, including down payment, closing costs, and the renovation budget, was approximately $198,000. The mortgage balance was around $190,000. In early September 2022, we had the property appraised with the intention of either refinancing or listing it. The appraiser came back with a number that made me sit down in the empty living room for a long moment. $847,000. The neighborhood had moved faster than either of us anticipated. 2 tech companies had announced satellite offices nearby. The park renovation was complete and stunning. 3 comparable properties on the same street had sold above asking within days of listing. The timing, the renovation quality, and the location had converged perfectly. After the mortgage payoff of approximately $190,000, we were looking at net proceeds of roughly $657,000 if we sold at appraisal value. Half of that was $328,500. I called Derek that evening, genuinely excited, ready to celebrate what we'd built together. What I heard on the other end of the line was not the voice of my friend celebrating with me. It was the voice of someone who had been doing calculations of his own. Update 1. The fracture. I've been thinking about the split, Derek said, before I'd even finished expressing how happy I was about the appraisal. There was something careful in his voice. Prepared. Okay, I said slowly. The 50-50 agreement was based on assumptions that didn't hold. I've put in close to $200,000 in actual capital. You've put in labor, which I appreciate, but labor isn't capital. It's not at risk the same way. If the house had flopped, I would have lost $200,000. You would have lost time. I felt something cold move through me. Derek, we agreed. We agreed to split proceeds equally. But that was before I fully understood the financial asymmetry. I had a financial advisor look at this, and she agrees that a fair split would weight capital contribution more heavily. I'm thinking something like 65/35. You'd still clear over $200,000. I didn't say much after that. I told him I needed to think. He said that was fine, that he wasn't trying to be difficult, that he just wanted it to be fair. Fair. I spent that night going back through our original agreement, reading those 2 thin pages over and over. He wasn't technically wrong that the document was silent on labor valuation. He wasn't technically wrong that his capital was at greater financial risk than my time. But he was completely, fundamentally wrong about what we had agreed to in spirit, in conversation, and in the handshake understanding that had governed everything from the beginning. I had turned down 3 paying jobs during the renovation period. My foregone income over those 8 months, working on our property instead of client projects, was somewhere north of $80,000. I had contributed nearly $100,000 in labor value. The appraisal hadn't landed at $847,000 because Derek wrote checks. It had landed there because I had transformed a condemned adjacent wreck into a showpiece. The more I sat with it, the more I understood what was actually happening. Derek had looked at a life-changing sum of money and found a rationalization for taking more of it. The fact that the rationalization had some logical scaffolding made it more disturbing, not less. I called an attorney the next morning. Not to threaten Derek. To understand where I stood. Update 2. The education. My attorney's name is Sandra, and she is worth every dollar I have ever paid her. When I laid out the situation, the verbal agreement, the 2-page document, the labor logs, the appraisal, she listened without interrupting and then asked me a series of precise questions. Had the original verbal agreement been witnessed? Partially, our mutual friend James had been present for at least one conversation where Derek and I discussed the labor for capital structure. Did I have documentation of my labor hours? Yes. Detailed, time-stamped, professionally formatted. Did I have documentation of the work itself? Yes. Permit records, inspection sign-offs, contractor invoices, before and after photographs. Everything. Was there any written communication, texts, emails, where the 50-50 split was referenced in the context of my labor contribution? I spent 2 hours that afternoon going through 3 years of messages. And yes, there were texts. Multiple texts, including one from Derek sent during the renovation that read, "You're putting in serious work over there. Half of a big number is still a big number. We're going to be glad we did this." Sandra read that text and smiled. "He's not going to enjoy this process," she said. Here is what she explained to me. While the written agreement was thin, the totality of evidence, The verbal structure of the deal, the witness conversations, the text messages, the documented labor contribution, the demonstrable increase in property value directly attributable to my work, created a strong foundation for arguing that the original 50-50 agreement was valid and binding, and that Derek's unilateral attempt to revise it after the fact was not. More importantly, she explained something I hadn't fully considered. We were in a legal partnership. The property was jointly owned. Derek could not sell it without my signature. I could not sell it without his. And in a legal dispute over partnership terms, courts look at the full picture of the agreement, not just the written pages. He can't squeeze you out, Sandra told me. He needs you. The question is whether he knows that yet. My strategy clarified over the next several days, and I want to be clear, it was never about hurting Derek. It was about holding the line on an agreement that I had honored fully and that he was attempting to revise from a position of financial advantage. I was not going to accept 35% of something I had built with my hands. But I was also not going to blow up a friendship over this if I didn't have to. I decided to give Derek one opportunity to come back to the original agreement before this became a legal matter. I wrote him a letter. Not a text, not an email. A formal letter, prepared with Sandra's guidance, that outlined the original agreement, documented my contributions, referenced the text messages and witness conversations, and politely but unambiguously stated that I expected the 50-50 split to be honored. I sent it by certified mail and by email, so there would be no question of receipt. I gave him 2 weeks to respond. Update 3. The escalation. He did not respond within 2 weeks. What he did instead was call me on day 10 and try to have a conversation that I can only describe as a negotiation costumed as a friendship conversation. Marcus, come on. I'm not trying to cheat you. I'm just trying to be realistic about what each of us contributed. Can we get together and talk about this like adults? Derek, I sent you a letter. Did you read it? A pause. I read it. Then you know my position. I'm not negotiating the percentage. We agreed to 50-50, I delivered on my end completely, and I expect you to deliver on yours. You had an attorney write that letter. I consulted an attorney, yes. Marcus. His voice dropped into something more personal, more intimate. We've been friends for 7 years. Don't do this. This was the moment I'd been dreading. Because he was right that we were friends. And he was right that this was going to damage something. But he was wrong about who was doing it. He had made a choice to revise an agreement after the fact because the numbers got large enough to tempt him. That choice had consequences, and they weren't mine to absorb. Derek, I said, I've been your friend for 7 years. I've also done approximately $100,000 of labor on that house based on a specific agreement. I'm not asking for anything more than what we agreed to. But I'm also not going to accept less. That's not me being litigious. That's me respecting what we built together, both the house and the friendship. He didn't say much after that. Called me rigid. Said I was making this harder than it needed to be. The 2 weeks passed. He didn't sign anything. Sandra filed a formal legal claim asserting my right to 50% of the net proceeds and requesting the court to affirm the original partnership agreement. She also filed a motion to prevent either party from executing a sale of the property pending resolution of the dispute. This was not a move designed to punish Derek. It was a move designed to prevent him from finding a creative way to force a sale on his terms before the matter was adjudicated. It was also, Sandra told me, likely to change the temperature of Derek's thinking rather quickly. Because now he had his own attorney to pay, a timeline that was outside his control, and the distinct possibility that a judge would look at our text messages and documented history and hand me exactly what I was asking for, plus legal fees. James, our mutual friend, called me about a week after the filing. He'd heard from Derek. He's really upset, James said. I know. He says you're destroying the friendship over money. James, I said carefully, did Derek ever tell you how we structured the deal when we bought the property? A pause. He said you were going to do the work and he was going to put up the capital and you'd split it down the middle. That's correct. And now he wants to change that. He wants 65%. A long silence. That's not what you agreed to. No, it isn't. James, it turned out, was one of those witnesses Sandra had asked me about. He had been present during an early conversation where Derek and I had explicitly discussed the labor for capital structure. He hadn't been asked to sign anything. He hadn't been thinking of himself as a witness. But he remembered the conversation clearly, and when Sandra's office reached out to him formally, he agreed to provide a written statement. Derek's attorney called Sandra shortly after that. Update 4. The resolution takes shape. I want to be honest about this period, because it wasn't triumphant. It was exhausting and sad in ways I hadn't fully prepared for. Derek and I had not spoken directly in nearly 2 months. 7 years of friendship, reduced to communications between attorneys. Every time I drove past a hiking trail we'd done together or caught a football game on TV, there was a weight to it. But I also want to be honest about something else. I slept fine. I had done nothing wrong. I had honored our agreement completely, documented everything professionally, and pursued a legal remedy through proper channels when the agreement was violated. I had behaved exactly the way I would want a business partner to behave toward me. The mediation process that our attorneys eventually negotiated was the right venue. A neutral mediator, both parties present with counsel, a structured process for presenting evidence and reaching a binding resolution. Derek's attorney had, to his credit, given Derek an honest assessment of their position. The text message evidence was damaging. James's written statement was damaging. My documentation of labor hours, cross-referenced with permit records and inspection dates, was extremely damaging. There is something quietly powerful about 1,147 hours of time-stamped records when you're trying to prove that you showed up and did the work. At mediation, Derek's attorney made an opening argument that was intelligent and not without merit. The capital at-risk argument, the market conditions argument, the claim that labor and financial investment carry different risk profiles. Our response was methodical. The original agreement, as established by written communications, witness conversations, and the conduct of both parties over the 18-month renovation period, was unambiguously 50-50. The attempt to revise that agreement was post hoc and unsupported by any contemporaneous documentation suggesting Derek had ever communicated a different understanding. The mediator asked Derek directly, had he, at any point during the renovation period, communicated to Marcus that he believed the split would be anything other than 50%? Derek was quiet for a long moment. No, he said. I hadn't. That was the turning point. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just a quiet admission in a conference room that the agreement had been what it was. We settled at 52/48 in Derek's favor. Not 50-50, but close. The 2-point differential was a concession Sandra recommended I make to avoid the uncertainty of full litigation and to acknowledge, in some small formal way, that Derek's capital contribution did carry real financial risk. It wasn't the pure outcome I'd wanted, but it was overwhelmingly fair, and it was resolved. The property sold 4 weeks later for $831,000. After the mortgage payoff and closing costs, net proceeds were approximately $624,000. Derek received $324,480. I received $299,520. Nearly $300,000. For a house I'd spotted, planned, and built with my own hands. Update 5. The aftermath. Derek and I have not spoken since the mediation, other than brief functional communications required to execute the sale. I don't know if we ever will again in any meaningful way. That grief is real, and I'm not going to wrap it in a neat bow and tell you the justice made it all okay. Losing a 7-year friendship costs something that no settlement figure replaces. What I can tell you is what I've learned, and I mean this specifically and practically, not as a platitude. First, verbal agreements between friends are not agreements. They are intentions. Intentions are beautiful things, but they are not contracts. If I could go back to that video call in late 2021 where Derek said, "You front the capital, I put in the labor, we split it 50-50, I would say, great. Let me have an attorney draft a 2-page document that says exactly that, including how labor will be valued, what happens if we disagree on sale timing, and how disputes will be resolved." The conversation would have taken 30 minutes. The document would have cost maybe $500. It would have prevented everything that followed. Second, documentation is not distrust. I kept time logs because that's my professional habit, and those time logs became the single most important piece of evidence in my case. Derek could dispute my memory of our conversations. He could dispute James's memory. He could not dispute 1,147 time-stamped entries that showed exactly what I did, when I did it, and for how long. If you are contributing labor to any joint venture, document it like you expect to testify about it one day. Not because you assume bad faith, but because circumstances change and memories diverge and paper doesn't. Third, the moment someone tries to revise a completed agreement because the outcome is better than expected, that tells you everything you need to know about how they will behave when the stakes are high. Derek wasn't a bad person before the appraisal came in. He was my friend. But he looked at $657,000 in net proceeds and let ambition override integrity. People reveal themselves in those moments, and what they reveal is permanent. Fourth, legal remedies exist for exactly the situation, and using them is not a betrayal. I cannot tell you how many times, during those months, I questioned whether I was being too aggressive, too rigid, too loyally. Friends don't sue friends, right? But here's what I kept coming back to. Derek had an attorney advising him from the moment he decided to revise the split. He simply hadn't told me that. I was the only person in this dispute who was trying to handle it personally and emotionally, and that asymmetry was being used against me. The moment I retained Sandra and began responding through proper channels, the playing field leveled. That's what legal remedies are for. Fifth, and this is the one that stays with me most, the value you create is yours. I transformed a deteriorating house into something extraordinary through 16 years of professional skill, 1,147 hours of physical labor, and a vision that I had developed and pursued. Derek's capital made it possible to acquire the property. My work made the property worth what it became. Both contributions mattered. Neither one superseded the other. The moment someone tries to tell you that your labor is worth less because it wasn't at risk, the same way capital is, ask them to imagine what their investment would have returned without you. The answer, in my case, was a deteriorating craftsman bungalow in a nice neighborhood, worth maybe $450,000 in unrenovated condition, maybe $480,000 tops. My work added $350,000 to $400,000 in value. That is not a minor contribution. That is the contribution. Reflection. I bought another property 6 months ago. A duplex this time, in a different neighborhood that I've been watching quietly. I am the sole owner. I used my $299,520 as the down payment, secured the mortgage on my own, and I have begun the renovation with a clarity of purpose that feels different from before, cleaner, in some way, despite being lonelier. The work is good. The floors are beautiful. There's a breakfast nook in the upper unit that catches the morning light in a way that made me stop working one day last month just to stand in it for a while. I don't know what Derek is doing with his money. I don't know if he's found a way to justify to himself what happened, or if he thinks about it the way I do. I genuinely hope he's well. I hope the friendship we had meant as much to him as it did to me, even if that meaning wasn't sufficient to hold the line when the numbers got large. What I know is this: I built something. I proved what I built. I protected what I'd earned. And I did it without losing myself in the process, without becoming someone who retaliates destructively, or exaggerates claims, or acts from bitterness rather than principle. The house is sold. The friendship is gone. The lesson is permanent. If you're reading this because you're in a similar situation, a joint venture with a friend, a handshake deal, a partnership that made perfect sense until the money got real, please learn from my experience before you need to. Draw up the contract. Value the labor explicitly. Define the dispute resolution process. Do it because you respect the partnership and the friendship, not because you distrust your partner. The cost of that conversation, up front, is nothing. The cost of not having it can be everything. Thanks for reading. Happy to answer questions in the comments. And yes, I'm doing fine. Edit. To the people asking whether I feel guilty about lawyering up on a friend, no. I feel sad that it was necessary. Those are different things. Edit 2. For everyone asking for Derek's side of the story, I genuinely don't know it. I know the facts as I live them. I've tried to present this as accurately as I can, including the parts where his argument had some logic to it. He might have a version of this that sounds very different. Most disputes do. Edit 3. The property is under new ownership as of last month. I drove past it a few weeks ago. The new owners have already put a porch swing on the front deck I built. It looked good. It looked like a home. That part, at least, I'm at peace with.